And now for our concluding session, we go west to look at a housing transformation that is leaving many unsettled and uncomfortable. San Francisco is known as a hip, edgy foodie paradise and for its proximity to the center of all things technology, Silicon Valley. The advances created there have taken over all of our lives in many ways, and technology is now being said to take over San Francisco itself. And here to speak on this transformation, Sarah Short, San Francisco resident and executive director at the Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco, and to lead the discussion, my colleague Summer Mathis, editor of the Atlantic's City Lab. So Summer, welcome to the stage with Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Okay, it's the last session. I know you've been sitting here for a couple hours now. You're getting tired, but I promise you, Sarah and I are going to be really entertaining, controversial, and fisticuffs. It's going to be great.
And we drank lots of coffee.
So there's perhaps no U.S. city where the affordable housing crisis has become more acute in recent years than San Francisco. So that's the city that we're going to discuss right now. But before we do that, we wanted to frame this conversation with a short clip from a new HBO documentary by the filmmaker Alexandra Pelosi, which examines how wealth and the technology sector have and are transforming San Francisco. So just really quickly, let's take a look at a brief clip from San Francisco 2.0.
But why San Francisco? How did all the tech bros end up here? Well, it all started down in Silicon Valley. People were coming from all around the world to work there, but no one really wanted to live there. So the tech companies started chauffeuring their young talent on these luxury buses to and from where they really wanted to live, in San Francisco. After seeing the dark double-decker buses everywhere, it didn't take long for the wise leaders of the great city to wake up and smell the money. So Mayor Ed Lee and his advisors devised a plan to entice the tech companies to relocate to the city. By offering tax breaks to any firm that would move its headquarters into a region around the Tenderloin, a district known for its homeless and destitute, the city lured in the tech giants, creating the second gold rush for San Francisco and opening the Golden Gate for the techies to build their playground.
We've got 1,979 tech companies. I mean, we went from 9.5% unemployment rate to 5.2% in less than 2 years. So that's 42,500 new jobs.
In the Hunters Point area, I'm being evicted out of my home that I've been in for 27 years. I've grown up in this home. Hunters Point is not much of a good area, but it's home to everybody that's been there for so long. And all these companies coming in and taking over our area, it's a little difficult because we have nowhere to go. Where do we go? Where do we stand as a people in our own neighborhood where we're getting pushed out of because of these large billion-dollar tech companies?
As this drama plays out, a new kind of segregation between rich and poor is emerging. Good old San Francisco, the counterculture capital of the world, is in the middle of a pretty drastic makeover. Like many great cities around the world, San Francisco is being forced to reinvent itself. Everywhere you look, you see cranes building luxury high-rise apartments. And in neighborhoods all over town, the shells of the old houses are hiding new, expanded, and retrofitted palaces. These are the homes for a new generation who've been transforming this town into a power city. But as the march of progress pushes forward, the question is, will some be left behind?
I think we're rapidly becoming something like Venezuela, where there's a very small, ultra-rich class and everybody else is poor and the middle class is shrinking. I think the American dream is a load of crap. There is no American dream. It's a nightmare for most people.
Okay, on that positive note. So Sarah, at City Lab, we've been following this story in San Francisco pretty closely. I would characterize it as a dramatic housing affordability crisis. Perhaps you would agree, I'm sure. But for those of us in the room who maybe haven't been to San Francisco recently, perhaps you can give us if you can, a brief overview of what's really going on and what's it like to live there and to work on behalf of tenants, of renters in San Francisco. How tough is it for renters right now in San Francisco?
I happen to live at ground zero of the gentrification that is overtaking San Francisco right now. It's the Mission District. And what my neighborhood looks like right now is just about any coffee shop you go in, just trying to enjoy yourself with a cup of coffee. There's two young folks, usually men, usually white men, sitting next to you talking about their startup and what kind of money they have to invest in some new app. It's very real.
Because it's not just a caricature. This is
No.
like happening.
That's daily life,
Yeah.
and I think most people will tell you the same. On the other hand, regardless of what I happen to do for work, wherever I go, when I go to get my cup of coffee from the barista, they tell me about how, well, this is their last day because they have to move back to Santa Rosa. They can no longer afford to live here. When I take the bus, I overhear the conversations about, my mother is going to have to move to Vallejo, which is a suburb, really an exurb. You hear, as you're walking down the street, young people talking about how they've got to find a new roommate, but nobody's going to move in because the rent is, far too much for anyone of, their, demographic to be able to afford. So it really is a tale of two cities, and it's the contrast is so stark. You, on the one hand, have this sort of, I think, Disneyland, party, land of opportunity from a certain vantage point. However, if you're coming from a different perspective, it is a dark dystopia where you can't sleep at night because you wonder whether you'll be next.
Next to lose your home.
That's right.
Next to be priced out of your neighborhood.
That's right. And it affects people in all sorts of ways. Even if it's not about you personally losing your home, watching your neighbors one by one be displaced has a tremendous effect. Watching your your child's teacher have to leave, losing your medical providers, your mail carriers, the rapid change in terms of community that we all, I think, is one of the big reasons that draws us to cities, is that we have neighborhoods and we have neighbors and we have communities. Watching your building become a building full of tourists rather than longtime neighbors because of the Airbnb rentals that have also taken over San Francisco. It's just become a place with a tremendous economic divide. And what I have found is that I don't think that whether you're on one side or the other, there's really an understanding of what it really feels like on the other side of the fence. But I do know that it just can't be healthy for a city to be so divided in this way, and that
For the psyche of the city. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it certainly isn't healthy to have so many people basically living in trauma and crisis constantly because they are scrambling to figure out how to keep a roof over their heads, how to find a new roof for their children, how to afford all of the other necessities in life while they're paying 70% of their income for housing. I do think that it really is starting to be a place of severe, I think, psychological trauma that is impacting a wide swath of San Franciscans right now.
We touched on this a little bit in some earlier sessions, but I think one of the things that I've found over the years covering housing affordability issues at our publication that's complicated is some people talk about affordable housing as an issue for the very poor, the very low income people who really need a set of solutions that include, cash. They need subsidies in order to be able to afford to live anywhere. And then at the same time, what's going on in San Francisco, I mean, obviously, and I know you work in public housing as well, but what this other layer of middle class people who have their own affordability crisis going on that's totally separate from the very low income people who need a certain kind of assistance. How do you see that playing out in San Francisco in particular, in terms of the sort of attention and or help that very low income people are getting on this issue, and then the attention and or help for the middle class?
Well, one thing I think that's happening is we're getting more and more very low-income people than we once had. A lot of people who could have managed with the types of jobs they have and the education and professions they work in could have hung on a little more, in the past when housing costs were lower. Now they're really falling, down into a bracket where they need serious, subsidies.
And is that because costs have risen so much, or is there something else at play there that you see?
It's costs that have risen due to the intense competition for housing, and the huge amounts of affluent newcomers who are coming in and able to pay, whatever the asking price is for that housing. And so because the homeownership costs are so high, and you really can't find a place under $1 million anymore in San Francisco, you're seeing more renters as well. And renters are more and more being taken advantage of in this market because I think the real estate industry is well aware that there are very few other choices, and that renters are going to have to kind of put up or move out. And so what we've seen, and our agency serves renters who are having any type of housing problems, and they're banging down our doors right now. We cannot serve as many people as come through our doors by any means. And the types of problems we're seeing increasingly are evictions, rent increases, unaffordable rent increases, repairs and habitability issues, fair housing and discrimination issues. And one of the biggest things now we're seeing is people who just come in and say, our building is for sale, and they're like shaking, they're nervous, what can we do? That we don't necessarily have an answer for that the way we do with some of the other issues where we can say, well, here are your rights and here's some resources you have. But it just goes to show, it illustrates the high anxiety that anybody who is a renter in San Francisco right now is feeling. And so, renters are forced to do all sorts of things in order to stay in the city. And that means overcrowding. You look at places like Chinatown, and you have families who are all in one SRO hotel room. That's a residential hotel room with no kitchen, shared bathroom usually. You find, roommate upon roommate for the younger, millennial demographic.
Bunk beds, we've seen,
bunk beds.
yeah.
You also find people increasingly in more and more substandard housing, where they're putting up with, no heat, leaking, pipes, roaches, etc.
Because there's no incentive for landlords to follow the law?
Because landlords know that the tenants can't afford anything else. It's sort of this grand bargain where the tenants, move into a place maybe even knowing that exists because it's the only place now they can afford. And that's extremely problematic, especially at a time when you read stories day after day in the paper about some new exclusive club that's opened up downtown where the tech industry employees hang out and make $1 million deals.
Right.
And you watch them get on their special private buses and that one after another going down to their jobs in Silicon Valley. Again, you hear those conversations in the coffee shops. You also see them all around you. You see them at bidding wars for apartments where they offer to pay everything up front and then some. So the intensity of that very real contrast is, I think, just working up to a real boil.
So, obviously San Francisco is somewhat of a special case, right? There's the adjacencies geographically to the technology industry, and then San Francisco itself is quite, the city proper is a very small city. How many miles? 7 by 7?
7 by 7 square miles.
Yeah, it's small. It's even smaller than the district. So you've got this just tremendous influx of wealth that has happened really quickly, driven by the technology industry. And then at the same time, I think, across the country, one of the reasons CityLab.com exists, for example, is because we wanted to look at the sort of renewed interest in living downtown and living in urban centers. And what we're seeing is that, these young, wealthy people all want to live in the great neighborhoods. They want to live in walkable neighborhoods. They want the sort of whole urban experience, and that's something that's really been championed, nationwide. So, but what you're describing is kind of this massive culture clash.
Right.
Do you blame them for wanting to live in your city?
Well, first of all, here's the deep irony of that. As you said, they want to live in an urban, I think you said culture. They want to live in places where there are arts, where there are, vibrant cultural scenes.
Right. Great restaurants.
Where there are great restaurants run by people of different immigrant and ethnic groups. They want to see murals, in San Francisco particularly, they want to see murals that the Latino community has done. They want to eat burritos, et cetera, et cetera. You get the sense. They like the LGBT culture. San Francisco's been known for that as well. For instance, that's what makes San Francisco so inviting and exciting, and a place where all those folks want to be and party at night and have their business discussions at daytime, et cetera. However, all of that is disappearing rapidly because of their very presence. We've seen in the Mission District, again, which is a heavily Latino district, 8,000 Latinos have been displaced in the last decade.
Where do they go?
They go to far outlying exurbs, again, often is where they go.
Yeah.
And if they're low income enough, they go to the streets. They end up homeless. We're seeing more and more homeless because of that very thing. You're seeing artists displaced. Again, articles in the paper. Artists who have just contributed so much to San Francisco. Some of them who are nationally renowned, losing their apartments due to evictions. You certainly see the new, younger LGBT folks, kids who have been coming to San Francisco for generations and generations. It's been a thing because it's unsafe to live in other places. They are now becoming homeless on the streets of San Francisco. So all of these, wonderful things that make San Francisco San Francisco, and therefore make these techies who, have gobs of money, want to be there, are being displaced by the fact that they are moving.
Okay, so you're painting a pretty bleak picture here.
I know, I'm about to make myself
I'm gonna, in the friendliest way possible, challenge a few things.
Okay.
I have the opportunity to speak to mayors of cities all over the country on a pretty regular basis, and on the one hand, I would argue that they might characterize what you're describing as kind of high-class problems. I'm pretty sure that the mayor of Grand Rapids or Rochester would be delighted if there were wealthy millennials who were clamoring to live in their cities, right? They don't have anything to attract the people you're talking about. Well, not anything. Please forgive me. Perhaps not as many job opportunities in the same. Should have polled the audience before I picked my examples there. You know, there are cities who would like to have these kinds of problems, right?
Well,
and then, you know, at the same time, you know, I hear what you're saying, and I think there needs to be a bigger conversation. There are also mayors who I talk to who are really closely watching San Francisco because they don't want to become the next San Francisco, and they're worried about it. So I think they're both of those things are true. And I guess what I want to do is ask you a little bit about your thoughts at this point, watching all that's happened about, you know, can we have economic development without displacement, and how do we do that?
Yeah. I think that a lot of policymakers are, and perhaps the business community, are falling into real black and white thinking. They think, well, blight is bad, lack of jobs is bad, poverty is bad, so the answer is, you know, high-end development and you know, industry, and that will save us. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way because of all the impacts of that on working-class people, poor people, and in places like San Francisco, middle-class people just as much. I think what's important is for folks to start being much more creative and innovative in thinking about what that middle ground looks like. You don't have to accept blight in order to say no to gentrification. I've also heard people say things like, well, I wish my neighborhood would be gentrified, you know, and it's because they want conveniences or even, you know, basic services. They want to have a grocery store in their community that doesn't exist, or they don't want falling down buildings next door to them. But the answer to that type of situation is not necessarily rapid development by industries that are, you know, making money, making millions overnight, and creating more and more millionaires, you know, over and over again. We witnessed, you know, Twitter go public, for instance, and we had hundreds of people, I think thousands, become millionaires overnight in our city, right? So one of the things we really think about in the organizing we do is how to allow for, you know, community economic development. There is such a thing. A lot of you who have been doing housing work know that. I think that politicians sometimes like to conveniently ignore that as a model, but there are things you can do to, you know, not necessarily restrict or say no to new industry, but yet at the very same time make sure that protections are in place so that when new people come in, it doesn't mean that the current people have to go. So there are all sorts of tools, including rent control. It's a very, very big tool that we have, including the land trusts, getting land off of the speculative market, and so that it doesn't fall prey to the out-of-town speculators who are really a big problem right now in San Francisco. You know, inclusionary zoning, all sorts of ways of actually protecting a community from the negative impacts of you know, industrial development when it comes in. So I don't think we have to just, you know, close the gates and say we want to stay, you know, as we are and accept maybe the poverty that we're experiencing, or maybe the fact that we don't have fresh vegetables at the corner store near us. But I think that there is a balance, and unfortunately, too often cities are not striving towards that, and instead jumping to the idea that you know, big tech, big industry is going to trickle down and, you know, rise all boats and that whole
I have
notion.
so many more questions for you, but I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So if there are questions, we've got one in the back here.
You know, I was wondering about the racial dimensions of this. I was talking to somebody in Detroit. We know what's going on in Detroit. Washington, D.C., the fastest gentrification ever, pushing black people out specifically. And when I lived in San Francisco, there were a couple of communities that were black. They're no longer there. I think they're in, is that correct? Are they in Oakland now or something?
We've gone from about 14% African American to about 5%.
Okay.
In, I think, since about 75, something like that.
So certainly in D.C., we're seeing black people pushed out of the city. I was talking to somebody at Oxfam, and they were actually telling me about how this is impacting cities in other parts of the world. What's the racial aspect? Is this pure racism and discrimination? I mean, what's the racial aspect?
You said it. I think it's not coincidental who happens to be being pushed out of San Francisco now and who happens to be coming in and replacing those folks. I spoke about the Latino community, which has always been a big part of San Francisco, that again, often attracts people to come see, that part of the city. African American community, just the same. The African American community has been basically facing an exodus, a forced exodus. And the folks that we're seeing move into the city tend to be white, by and large. And that means our entire demographics of our city are shifting heavily. And, it also is shifting in terms of income, of course, too, right? And what's interesting about that is a big loop is being created, I think, where the newcomers, the demographics are different in such a way that it influences their politics as well. It influences their choices and their general thinking about the future of the city. And so when they go to the polls or they lobby their, city council folks or whatever, they are going to be pushing for the exact opposite of things that I think will help keep San Francisco as we've all known and loved it. So they're not necessarily going to, support limiting chain stores or rent control or some of these great, very San Francisco ideals and political, measures that we've taken in order to fend off our city from, completely being gobbled up by tech.
Got one question right here.
Thank you, Diane Williams, 22nd Century. What I'd like to hear, and I know you probably have thought about this, is what is the solution and what has been the outreach to the tech companies? As someone in tech, and I see, I'm afraid of the same thing happening here in Washington, D.C. I see it, and the gentleman back there did. Everyone does see it. But what do a lot of these companies, they're socially aware, as they like to say. What are they doing? Have you reached out? Has the city reached out? Is there some solution that is being worked on now?
Well, the city has certainly reached out in the form of tax breaks, huge tax breaks, and you saw that referred to in the movie, to tech companies. The tech companies have reached out to the city in terms of huge campaign contributions to our mayor and some of the other board of supervisors. So no, tech is not taking responsibility and not being a good neighbor in terms of acknowledging the impact of their presence or simply caring about the community enough to give back. That's not to say that they haven't done certain initiatives, provided funding for specific pet projects, and things like that. It does happen, and it is happening more and more. The more folks like us make a fuss about what's going on in the city. But that becomes problematic too because it's philanthropy and it's branding. It's becomes the the Google bus, public transit bus, or the what we're having right now, the Mark Zuckerberg General Hospital. And that is really, really different than the tech companies paying their fair share of taxes so that those who really know where the need is greatest can make the decisions about the spending, and so that it is subject to a political process where the citizens who are being impacted by the spending decisions get to be accounted for and have a say.
I've got time for one last question. Over here.
I really appreciate your candor about the issue and your honesty And I wanted to just say that the discussion around Washington, D.C. is confusing to me in that we have lost a huge percentage of our affordable housing stock in the district, and we have had tremendous displacement with the redevelopment of neighborhoods and properties. And while in some cases there's one-to-one replacement, in many cases there is not. And that is not a solution at this point. And I appreciate you talking about the tools that you have and the issues that you have, and only through honest conversations are we going to be able, like this panel, are we going to be able to really get to the heart of the matter and live well in this country.
Thank you.
Well, I have one last question.
Okay.
So, one thing we didn't get to is, I think the working theory is, why don't we just build a ton more housing in San Francisco, right? I know, Gabriel Metcalf, who you probably know, who's the executive director of a think tank in the Bay Area called Spur, has written a series of pieces for us, really arguing that San Francisco kind of made its own bed by preventing new construction for decades, and that there was a chance perhaps to build up density in order to welcome all these new people into the city, and over and over again the city didn't take that chance. How do you square with that line of thinking?
I could talk for much longer than we have about this, but I think that is really a mischaracterization. I think that theory, it's supply side economics, it's neoliberal thinking that doesn't fit in the San Francisco model, and here's why. Half of our new construction of condos right now are second homes. They're pied-à-terres. That's one thing. We also are losing rent-controlled units day after day, approximately 1,000 a year. In, I think, the last decade, this is the city planning department did a housing balance report. We developed about 6,500 units of affordable housing. During the same period, we lost about 5,500 units of rent-controlled housing. So our net gain during that, I think it was like at least a decade, was only 1,000 units in a city like San Francisco, where we have such intense population growth. So we cannot build our way out of this crisis. The other factor is that as we build, and we're only building high-end housing right now. That's the only thing we're building. You should see there's about 30 cranes at least in the sky right now. We really are in a building boom. So that's one thing. If Metcalf's theory is correct, we'll see shortly the results. But the other thing that happens is that as you build these high-end condos in a neighborhood that is traditionally more houses working class people, immigrants, et cetera, property values go up. It is not in a vacuum, and is those exact same neighborhoods where we see a surge in evictions of long-time rent-controlled tenants. I can look at one case, Mary Phillips, who was 98 years old, lived in her building for over 40 years, was being evicted by a speculator, out-of-town speculator, not a landlord, a speculator. That's who's doing a lot of this. If you looked in her very adjacent area, you see across the street a huge new high-end condo with a butterfly habitat and a Whole Foods. You see next door to her another new condo development, and then across the street, just less than a block, another huge development. This is what happens. It creates an incentive for landlords or speculators, landlords to sell the buildings, speculators to swoop in and flip the buildings. New construction in San Francisco only, in my opinion, exacerbates the loss of rent-controlled housing. And so you cannot just build in order to backfill. We have to have much more of a net gain. The other thing is our city controller's office did an analysis of this. They agree that, yes, you can build and eventually you could perhaps start to see prices go down. But the number you would have to build, I think it was something like 100,000 new units, is absolutely unrealistic. It could never happen.
Not
So-
fast enough.
No, exactly. So we cannot look to that as as an answer. Instead, one of the
But part of the
maybe
answer?
part of the answer, sure, especially with inclusionary housing, built in.
Right.
But in what is being ignored is the preservation of the precious few affordable housing units that we have, and that's both affordable housing units in the term of sort of subsidized units, public housing, et cetera, but also rent-controlled units. The other thing, innovative solutions we need to look towards and do more about is, using what we have. Again, Section 8 vouchers, they do nothing in a city like San Francisco. Our market is so expensive that first of all, we have a closed waiting list. It's been closed for 10 years. But if you were lucky enough to get your hands on a piece of that gold, you can't use it in the city because the rents are so high.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot that can be done beyond the solution of let's build, build, build.
Okay. We could talk about this for so much longer,
Definitely.
but unfortunately we're out of time. Sarah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank
And my
Thank you.
apologies. America's greatest city.
Thank you to all of our speakers and to our Loud Atlantic moderators. Thank you to a wonderful audience. I think this has been an engaging conversation, and I want to take a moment to thank AARP again and the AARP Foundation for making this possible. Finally, your feedback is vital to us, so please fill out the comment cards that you'll find on your seats before you go. We're going to have the reception right down the hall in the POV Lounge. Starting right after this. And I'd also wanted to mention that the Atlantic is hosting a small business summit tomorrow afternoon at Impact Hub DC from 3 to 5:30 p.m. Ask any of our staffers or go on our website if you'd like to join us. You're welcome to join. So thank you so much.